Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. My name's Nader. In this video, I'd like to go through arrays. Now, arrays are going to be quite a long topic. I have actually quite a few videos lined up. I was debating how to structure these videos because arrays in JavaScript and in every language are actually so central and kind of a fundamental type that's used across everything that we're going to learn. Backend, front-end, React, all sorts of different frameworks all use arrays in various ways, and kind of getting familiar with this concept is pretty central to becoming an expert or even an intermediate in JavaScript eventually. So that said, we're going to start with the basics of arrays in this video. We're going to look over the basic concepts. We're going to look over a bunch of examples together. We're going to code out kind of manipulating them at a kind of a basic level. And then after we're done that, we're going to look at some of the newer ways that we can actually manipulate these arrays and kind of get our hands a bit more dirty when it comes to how we can maybe anticipate seeing these in things like React and other frameworks, for example, in the future. Let's get right into it. All right, so I want to show you a bunch of drawings as I normally have lined up, but before we get to those, I kind of just want to set the stage and the premise for why we actually need arrays in JavaScript or just in computers in general. So I'm just going to create a new file in Visual Studio Code. I've already opened up a folder in here where I can kind of dump a bunch of code. I encourage you to do the same thing. So I'll just do arrays concepts.js. You can call it whatever you like. But I want you to think of this question. Imagine that I want to create a collection of items. And in this case, let's assume that the items are all related. And this is a pretty kind of important distinction when it comes to arrays, which are collections of items in different languages. We want to have these items be related to each other in some way instead of totally disparate and unrelated. So let's see what I mean. Let's say we want to create a program that works with let's say vegetables, for example. And let's say we have many different vegetables. I don't know many vegetables actually off the top of my head, especially kind of on the fly, but let's do my best here. So let's just say const veggie is equal to a cucumber. Okay, it's actually my favorite vegetable. Now let's say we want to be able to work with many other vegetables. So let's say maybe we have a second vegetable, and maybe that's kale, for example, right? How would we kind of go about not only naming this variable, but kind of assigning it? So you might be tempted to do something like this, like maybe something like const, veggie2 is equal to kale, just like that. This is a bit weird. Maybe now we want to change this to veggie1 because now we have two, so it's just like 1, 2, 3. So we can keep going with this, maybe like const veggie3. What's another vegetable? Maybe beet. But eventually we're going to kind of hit a wall, right? Let's say that we want to start kind of logging these out. So we could say something like console.log, and we'll say like veggie1, and then we want to log out veggie2, and then we're going to log out veggie3. Now this might be fine for a few variables, maybe even, arguably 4 or 5, all the way up to maybe a dozen maximum, I'd say. Eventually you get pretty tiresome, right? This naming convention is pretty, frankly, quite awful, right? These are all related to each other, and we're kind of distinguishing them by this number and then kind of like the type of this thing, in this case a veggie. If you imagine, say, like a storefront, for example, or a grocery store, they have dozens or even sometimes hundreds of these vegetables. Imagine coding a program to work with those, and you end up having like veggie, 123, right? And if you want to add more vegetables or remove vegetables or change or update vegetables, that would get incredibly tedious and very tiresome, right? And very error prone as well. There would be a lot of bugs that would pop up in your veggies. So how can we kind of structure this in a better way? Well, that's actually what arrays are. They allow us to group together similar concepts into one neat package. And the technical term for this is array, but you can think of it basically as a list or a collection. Many other languages kind of have different names for this, but the kind of computer science name for it is an array. Okay. So I'm going to flip over to kind of my drawings for a second, and we'll look at how we can kind of improve upon this concept, and we'll come back and code it together. All right. So over here, I have a bit of code on the left-hand side of the screen, and I have the kind of memory architecture on the right-hand side of the screen. So let's focus on the left-hand side for now, just this area that I have highlighted right here in blue. So what is this? This is how we make an array in JavaScript, and this is actually pretty similar for most languages. You notice that we're using a new type of bracket. We haven't seen this one before. Up till now, we've been using kind of regular parentheses, which are kind of the regular non-fancy parentheses, and then the curly fancy parentheses, which are used for things like functions, for example, and if statements, and for loops. But this square bracket is kind of the other type of bracket that we can use, and these are reserved for arrays and a few other specific things in the language, which we'll get to later. In this case, I am creating an array by starting and ending square brackets. Inside of the array, we can declare many different items. And these can be variables, or they can be the actual data themselves. So in this case, instead of referring to variables, I'm just actually declaring the animals in this case as strings kind of in line in the initializer for this array. So the way to read this is I'm starting and closing an array, and I'm storing 4 strings inside of this array when it gets declared and initialized. I'm storing the string monkey, dog, cat, and koala. Each of these is a string, as I mentioned, because we can see they're surrounded by double quotes, which is how we do strings in JavaScript. You can also use single quotes. It's really up to you. Just be consistent. But the most important thing here is that they're all separated by commas. Okay, and this is how we kind of can say, okay, I'm done with this one, and now I want to move to the next item. Okay. What you'll also notice is that I've kind of given this a name, right? So I pointed the variable animals at this array after I've declared it. So now that we've seen how that looks, I'd like to kind of focus our attention to the right side of the screen over here, which is this computer memory architecture that I have. So I always kind of hesitate a little bit when I go through this, but I think that this concept is so central, as I mentioned, to all of computing and every language that you touch and all types of programming that you do, that visualizing this and understanding it will absolutely go a long way to your understanding of programming in general. So let's look at what this looks like inside the actual computer's memory or the computer's RAM when it gets declared. We have 4 strings. So very similar to how we looked at kind of variables being stored inside the computer's memory, this is the exact same thing. We have, in this case, 4 strings starting with monkey, then dog, then cat, and ending with koala. And that corresponds to the order of the strings that I have here. What's interesting though is that I actually added some numbers here as well, and I showed that this really is the label for animals. You'll notice something kind of weird. The numbers start at 0. Now I'm kind of not one of the I don't want to be one of those weird humans that kind of like starting at 0 and counting things. Generally in computing, we start with numbers at 0 when we are dealing with collections of things, specifically things like arrays. So we would refer to the first item as the 0th item, and then the second item as the first item, which is super confusing, and there are many jokes online about how confusing this is and how it leads to many different bugs, but I'll save you kind of that. But most importantly, and I didn't put this in this diagram, is that this set of numbers right here, 0, 1, 2, and 3, are actually called the indices. And each one is called an index, right? So many indices and one index. So an array has indices from 0, which is the first item, all the way up to the length of the array minus 1, because we're starting at 0. Okay, so in this case we have 4 items, monkey, dog, cat, and koala. So we're going from 0 to 3. All right. So why is this important? Why am I confusing you with a new numbering system where we start counting at 0 instead of 1 like everyone else? It turns out that in order to actually get at this data later, when we want to do things like print it out, for example, one at a time, we actually need to know these indices. All right, great. So let's look at this in action in code. I'll flip back to VS Code over here. I'll just create a new file. I'll just call this indices.js. So I'll create that same array. I'll call it animals. And I'll just say monkey. What did I have? I had a dog, cat, and koala. I was going to do emojis, but I didn't want to get people too confused, so we'll eventually introduce more emojis as we go along. So let's say we have these 4 items, right? Just like in the diagram that I just showed you. So what we can do is we can print this out. I can do console.log and I can do animals. But before I do that, I just want you to notice the syntax, right? This part here before the equal sign is the same. We've seen this before, right? We have a label or a variable and we're pointing it at something. In this case, that something is this new data type. It's an array, right? And these arrays, as I mentioned, start with the square brackets. If you can't find these brackets, they are the same ones that you'd use for curly braces, but without pressing shift first, usually near the enter key. Most importantly, in this case, I can say that this array has 4 strings and they're separated by commas to denote that we're kind of creating a new block in memory for each of these items. So these are all separate independent items in this array. So I can say this is the first, second, third, and fourth item. That's not to be confused with their indices. So this has index 0, index 1, 2, and 3. So let's actually see what this looks like if I was just to print out the variable being pointed at by animals in this case. Make sure I'm in the right folder. I'm going to run node and then indices.js. And you'll see that I have monkey, dog, cat, and koala. And these are surrounded by square brackets, right? So we're actually printing out the entire array all at once. Okay, so this is kind of a visual, I guess you can say, in the console or the terminal for what an array looks like. Now, let's say I wanted to actually print out just monkey. How would I do that? That's where we need to actually know the indices. Now remember, the indices start at 0 and then go up till the array's length minus 1. So if I have monkey here, monkey is at index number 0, which is the first item. So in order to access elements in an array, we do what's called indexing into the array. So we're gonna use this label animals and we're gonna give it an index and it's gonna find out where that number is by following that arrow to find that value. Okay, so let's look at what that looks like. If I want to say, like, let's just assign this to a variable, let's say const monkey. To actually access monkey as a string from inside animals, I can index into animals by using animals as the variable name in this case, and then using square brackets, and then the index number that I want, in this case, index number 0. So right here, I'm saying, please go to the animals array and find the first item, which is at index 0, and point the variable monkey at that item. So monkey is going to point to the string monkey. So let's prove that. If I console.log this out, monkey, there we go. Just clear this out so we can see it a bit better. And we'll see that we still get the array printed out, which is what's happening on line 3, but now we're actually getting the string monkey pointed out, and that's at index 0. So really quick, I'd like you to try to figure out how would you grab koala. All right, if you give that a chance, you probably, hopefully came up with something like this, koala, and we want to index into animals. And if we count from the start, let's see what we get. So we're getting 0, then 1, then 2, then 3. So I'm going to index into the animals array at index number 3 to grab that string in this case, and I'm going to console log it out. Hopefully I get the right answer, and indeed I do. A very common mistake or error is to be off by 1. So if I say there's 4 items in here, and I forget that we start at 0, and I try to get the 4th item, in many languages this would actually crash your computer. Let's see what happens in JavaScript. If I run this, curiously, you'll see that we get undefined, right? Very interesting. So in JavaScript, it tries to be helpful and not crash your computer like many other languages, and it just gives you undefined if you try to index into something that doesn't exist. All right, so just be careful when you're indexing into an array to make sure you're not off by 1 like this, or off by more than 1. So for example, if I tried to get index number 99, which also doesn't exist, I'm also going to get undefined because it's just not there. Okay, so do your best to avoid this. In the beginning, this is going to happen a lot. So don't worry, eventually you'll get used to zero-based indexing and how to actually grab these values out of an array. So I'll switch that back to 3. Perfect. I want to show you one more thing before we actually go to some array functions. What's nice about arrays is that they allow us to kind of treat everything in the same way and do functions on them, assuming that they are the same type. So what does this mean? Let's say that I know that this is an array of strings, right? I know that I have 4 strings in this array. I could actually use a loop to go through every single item in this array one at a time and do something to it, or even just print it out. So for example, let's create a loop. I'm going to say for let I equals 0. And now you'll see probably why I always start counting at 0 by habit, because of zero-based indexing with arrays. And then we're going to try to figure out what is the condition here, and maybe I++. All right. So this part I've left blank on purpose because we need to put something in here. So what is that thing? Well, we want to loop from 0 to, in this case, 3, right? 0, 1, 2, 3. So we could say while I is less than or equal to 3. All right, from 0 to 3, indexes 0 to 3, or indices 0 to 3. Then we can console.log out animals at the index I. Okay? I is going to start at 0. It's going to keep looping all the way until I is 3, and then it's going to stop. So we're going to actually grab animals at 0, 1, 2, and 3, and print them all out. I'm just going to put a little console log above this just so that we can see kind of a little bit of a separator between these, and I'm going to run this, see what we get. All right, so look at that. We get monkey, dog, cat, and koala in the same order as our array. That's pretty cool, right? So I actually didn't need to grab them one at a time. I could just use a loop and assume that the indices are in order and just kind of grab them one at a time right out of that array. So visually, we're kind of just walking down this memory list using the indices from 0 until the length of the array -1. Now, here's something kind of curious. Imagine that we add an item to this array later, which is what we're going to do right after this. Let's say I add elephant. And then if I run this code again, I stop at koala, right? And that's because I've hard-coded this to only loop until index number 3, which is koala. This is okay, but it's not ideal, and it really doesn't take advantage of the power of arrays. It would be awesome if there would be a way that we could just tell it to loop through everything in the array. It turns out that we can actually do that. There is a property on arrays that actually gives us the length of the array. So if I do animals.length right here inside of the conditional check, this is going to give me the length of this array. In this case, it's going to give me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So animals.length is going to be 5. Okay? So now if I add items or if I remove items, animals.length will dynamically adapt to that length. So I'm going to clear this and let's see what happens. Interesting. So I get monkey, dog, cat, koala. I do get elephant now, but I'm also getting undefined. Okay, try to think about why this might be. So the reason this is because we're actually going to less than or equal to animals.length. So this is effectively I is less than or equal to, in this case, 5. So we're actually asking for animals at index 5. But we don't have index 5. We have indices 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. 5 doesn't exist yet. So that's why we're getting undefined. We're going beyond the end of the array. So usually you would, if you're using this kind of syntax, where you're using something like the length property, you would usually just go less than if you're starting at 0. So if I do this, and I rerun this code, you'll see that I actually stop now at elephant. I don't actually go 1 beyond the end of the array. Perfect. Let's go to actually manipulating these arrays now. So there are a few ways that we can change this and actually add and remove items to this array. Let's look at the first one. So in this case, I have the same array animals, but I'm doing this new method on an array called push right here. I'm taking that variable animals and I'm doing a dot push on it and giving it a new value. In this case, I'm giving it a new string, cow. So the way to visualize this is push is always going to add that item that you give it as an argument to the end of the array that you're asking it to add to. So this is saying go to the animals array and push cow as a string onto the end of it. And the end of it is the string koala, so right after koala we're going to get cow. The nice thing about this is that the indices are already managed automatically for us. So previously we had indices 0, 1, 2, and 3 because we only stopped at koala. Now when we add cow, we also get a 4th index. So the length of this array is now 5, indices 0 through 4. Okay, so let's see how this works. I'm going to create a new file here. I'm going to call this array-push.js. Let's close this here. I'm going to grab this array right here and copy it over just to save some time. And let's say I want to push a new item to this array. But before I do that, I'm going to actually console log this out. In order to push something, we use the variable that is pointing to this array. In this case, animals is pointing to this array right here. And I'm saying on that array, I want to do a dot push. I'm going to give it a new value, let's say cow, and I'm going to console log out this animals array after I do that. So here I expect it to only have monkey, dog, cat, koala, and elephant. And then on line 5 I'm doing a push, and then on line 7 I'm going to log it out after the push is complete. So I should expect to see cow at the end of this array. Okay, I'm also going to just log out the length here. So I'm going to do animals.length. And I'm going to do animals.length down here as well. So right here, I expect this to be 5, and over here, I expect it to be 6. Let's see what we get. So I'm going to run node and array push.js. Let's look at this result. So these first few lines here are from the lines 3 and 4. First, I get the array printed out, so monkey, dog, cat, koala, elephant, and then the length of that array, which is 5. That checks out. On line 6, we're pushing cow onto it, and then we're looking at animals again and the length again. And you can see that cow is now added to the end of the animals array, and the length has been also updated automatically for us by JavaScript behind the scenes to be 6, right? And this is the beauty of kind of arrays and loops and using them together, is that we can dynamically change these things, and our code using loops, for example, if we're using the length property, will adapt to that new item, or if we remove an item, that removal of an item. Okay, so speaking of which, let's look at removing an item. So that was pushing an item to the end of an array in JavaScript. To remove an item from the end of an array, we use the pop method on the array. So just like we used push to add an item, pop will just remove an item. You'll notice that pop doesn't take any arguments in this case. We just call pop by itself like this, because it always will remove from the end no matter what. It will remove one item from the end. In this case, this is what the array will look like after we execute all this code. We push cow onto it like before, but then immediately pop it off the array. So now we end up with animals looking like it did before, with only monkey, dog, cat, and koala. And the indices, again, are also automatically adjusted. Okay. So I'm going to create a new file real quick. I'll call it array-pop.js. I'm going to copy this code over. And I'll say animals.push. And I'll say cow. And I'll console.log animals out. And then I'll do animals.pop. And I'll console.log animals out again. Okay. So we have 5 items in this array. We're pushing cow onto it, then it'll be 6. So expect cow to be at the end. Then we do pop, which removes an item from the end, which is cow that we just added. Then we log it out, and then we should get back to this array that we started with. Let's see if that's true. So if I do node array-pop, you'll see that we have this first print, which has cow in it, which is line 5, and then the second print, which has cow removed from it, which is on line 9. Okay. What you'll notice as well is if I pop a few times, so let's say I pop 3 times, let's see what happens. Try to think of what happens before I run this and print out the array. Okay. So, as you might have guessed, since we added cow, then we remove cow, then we remove elephant, then we remove koala in that order. And we end up with monkey, dog, and cat. Okay. Now this array has been permanently modified. We have permanently lost cow, elephant, and koala, unless we were storing it somewhere else in some other variables. Okay, one more thing as well before we get to the next bit is that the length here will be adjusted automatically just like before. Now let's look at this kind of quirky method. This is a little bit unique to JavaScript. It is definitely less used, but I did want to show it to you here because this is a common question asked by many people when they first learn this concept. We saw that push adds an item to the end of the array. What if we wanted to add an item to the start of the array? Well, that's where this funky named Unshift comes in. Okay. Now, I don't expect you to remember this. I always forget this one and mix it up with the next one I'm going to show you. So just know that it exists and how it might work in concept. And if you do end up using it, you can always just Google it and quickly remember and recall how it works. So in this case, we have our animals array, the same one as before. But we're doing animals.unshift llama as a string. Now, unshift adds an item to the start of the array, unlike push, which adds it to the end of the array. So we do end up with the item added to the array and the indices being updated from 0 through 4, but llama is now at index 0, where monkey used to be. And everything else gets pushed forward by 1 index. Okay, so let's see this in action. I'll create a new file. I'll call this array-unshift.js. I'm gonna paste over my animal list, my monkey list, and I'll do console.log of animals just to see it really quick at the start. Then I'm going to say animals.unshift, and I'm going to add llama to the beginning, right? Super cute animal. And I'm going to console.log out animals. Okay. So if I run node and then array-unshift.js, you'll see that I have this array with the 5 items in it to start on line 3, and then llama gets added to the beginning and everything gets shifted over by 1. Okay, so monkey is now at index 1, and dog is now at index 2, etc. Okay, try to think about how that works and prove to yourself that these indices work the way they do. And once you've done that, we'll go to the final method on arrays I want to show. Okay, so just like pop, allowed us to remove an item from the end of an array. Shift is the kind of corresponding operator for unshift to remove an item from the start of an array. So in this case, if I have this animals array, and then I unshift llama, that adds llama onto the start, just like we saw earlier. I think I moved it over a bit. There we are, right? So then we end up with this. But then if we shift the array, that will remove the first item from the array, and it'll re-index everything. So we will end up with the array looking like this right here, where monkey is now back at index 0 and koala is back at index 3. All right, so I'll just create one last file. I'll call this array-shift.js. I'm going to paste my animals. I'm going to say animals dot, let's just say unshift llama. I'm going to log it out. And if I do animals.shift and I call it, this will remove the first item. And since we unshifted llama to the start of the array, it's going to remove llama. So if I console.log out this animals list, let's see what happens. Do array-shift. So you can see that I have llama added to the start of the array right here, which is happening on lines 3 and 5. And then when I do a shift on line 7 and log out the array again on line 9, and llama is removed, and monkey goes back to index 0. Okay, so you can imagine, just like before, if I do a few shifts in a row, try to think of what this will do to the array. And then when you run this code again, you'll see that we have shifted items off the start of the array, which is the opposite of pop, and we end up with cat, koala, and elephant. Okay, perfect. So I know that was quite a lot in one go. A lot of these are related to each other. There are even more array functions available. I do want to share with you really quick a resource you can use to learn a bit of these if you're interested, and just as a teaser for the future videos that we're going to look at together. I'd like you to quickly open up Google and look up arrays.js. Okay, I'll zoom in here a little bit. And there are a couple of results. I'm going to go to the MDN docs because those are my favorite documentation for JavaScript by Mozilla. If I zoom in a little bit here as well, you'll see that they have a nice documentation on arrays, a lot of fun content to read about it. But on the left-hand side here, you'll see all these methods. And we have used a couple of these. So if I scroll down here real quick, you'll see that here's shift, for example. Unshift is here, push and pop are here, right? However, there are a whole bunch of other ones. All right, we're going to go through a few of these. Most notably, we're going to go through map, filter, and reduce in the upcoming videos because those are the most used. However, there are many others that are definitely used a lot as well. As a quick teaser and exercise for your brain, I'd like you to look through this list and try to think, what method would you use here that will allow us to remove items from anywhere in the array? Because so far we saw pop, which removes items from the end of the array, and shift, which removes items from the start of the array. What method allows us to remove items maybe from the middle of the array, or some arbitrary index inside the array? Okay, once you found that, I encourage you to post it in the comments. I'd love to hear how you tried it out and see if it works the way that you intend, or if you found anything confusing about it. So that said, in the next video, what we're going to go through together is some exercises on arrays, because this is just so central to everything that we're going to be doing, and I want to kind of give you some more complicated practice to go through. So if you're interested in that, check out that video. And once we're done that together, we're going to go through map, filter, and reduce, which are the three functional methods on arrays that are going to allow us to really supercharge using arrays and come up all the time in web development frameworks, for example, like React and many others. So if you enjoyed this video and you found it valuable, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd like to hear what you thought of this video in the comments, as well as anything that might have gone wrong. Love to help you out in there. Until the next video, which will go through the problem sets, I'll see you there.